Welcome to the Ethics Experts. We are here with Marissa Orr. Hey, Marissa, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I have been stalking your LinkedIn since I read your book last year. It has been definitely one of the top 10 books I read in 2019. And it just, like I was saying before we started recording, it is, what I think should be required reading for anybody who's in the ethics and compliance or the HR space. You have such a unique perspective on this diversity and inclusivity issue. And I think we need to just, be kind of screaming this from the rooftop. So I'd love to just kind of jump right in and hear a little bit about your story. And, we can talk a little bit about the book and just kind of see where it goes.
Sounds good to me.
So tell us a little, tell those of us who have not read it yet, kind of, give us the story,
Yeah, there's so many stories,
Yeah.
but I will try and condense it the best I can. So essentially, I worked at Google for 13 years, and I was at Facebook for a year and a half. And while I was at Google, there were a ton of workshops on female empowerment and diversity, all really aimed at helping their female employees succeed. And I've been a real passionate supporter of women's issues since I was a kid, really. And naturally, I attended everything and was really excited about it in the beginning. And then over time, I started to become disenchanted with the overall narrative of women at work because it felt narrow. It didn't seem fully honest to me because the conversations I was having with my female friends at work or over a drink just were really different than what we were hearing in sort of the mainstream and what the women were saying on stage. And so I started to think more deeply about it, end up writing my own perspective on the topic and sort of what we were getting wrong. And then I had sort of plans to expand that at Facebook, but Facebook turned out to be a very different experience than I had anticipated for reasons I go into in the prologue of the book. And I ended up turning the lecture series into a book, which is now Lean Out. And the premise really, it's a counter argument to Lean In, but really all books of that nature and modern sort of feminist, is it too early to say rhetoric in the conversation, but it's sort of a counter perspective, which is, I just felt that those conversations were dominated by a very small group of elite and powerful women. And I didn't hear my concerns and my challenges reflected in the public conversation. And so I wrote Lean Out to tell a very different side of this story to women at work. And I think that the reason that it resonates with so many people is it's sort of it's very honest, everyday, I was going to say woman's perspective, but I think it's been resonating with men and women alike. And so I wrote this to represent their voices and my voice and tell a different side of the story because there was a distinct lack of honesty, I felt like. And I felt a lot of us couldn't be honest about what was really happening. And so in a way, this was my way of giving myself and everyone permission to be honest about their challenges at work. And just I'll wrap this one up quickly by just saying that the overall premise really is that, Lean Out and books of that nature pin the blame for the gender gap on things like stereotypes and cultural oppression. Whereas I believe, if men and women want different things at work, that's okay. We should listen to women and really understand their perspectives so we can figure out, what is it about the corporate structure that needs to change? And I think that's the crux of it, which is the corporate structure was designed as, competitive zero-sum game for power and dominance by men 250 years ago in the industrial age. And literally, this is the first time in this country, we really need to figure out how to organize and motivate hundreds of workers around some, business goals. And if you're a titan of that era, you're a man, and you're going to set it up in your own worldview. And research shows that, men are more motivated by competition and women are more motivated by collaboration. So if you're more motivated by competition, you're going to set it up that way. It makes sense. But literally everything has changed since then. The entire economy has transformed. The composition of the workforce is completely different. And yet these structures underneath remain exactly the same. Literally nothing has changed in 250 years in how we structure businesses. So really the question I pose in the book is, what makes more sense? Rewiring women's personalities to conform to this outdated system, or rewiring the system to better meet the needs of today's diverse workforce?
And I think that's why it like resonates so much with men and women alike, because when we pull the sex piece back, what we're really talking about is,
Personality.
we're talking about personality. Exactly. So, there's a lot of nice articles in the New York Times, and there's, a lot of buzzwords around inclusivity and meeting people where they're at. And, a lot of great things about diversity, but we seem to only really scratch the surface of what we're kind of talking about here. And I think there's a different dimensionality to this conversation, which you really capture so well in the book, and that is around personality, and those are around the ways that folks are wired.
Yeah.
And you touch on this point of, the old, let's call it the old world, economy is based on sort of these titans of industry and these sort of alpha male centric, power structures. And in that, it's kind of, people are labor units. People are pawns on the chessboard that are moved around in pursuit of the almighty dollar, right? So to your point, though, this pendulum has swung to a new economy where really we're all knowledge workers now. Not all, obviously, there's still manufacturing and stuff like that, but even in those businesses, it's not the 14-year-old, 12-year-olds working on some machine in 15-hour days, right? Which is obviously a caricature of this sort of old world picture, but there's so much more collaboration inherent to our economy now. There's so much more collaboration in the knowledge worker space that, to your point, these structures have not sort of morphed toward, because they're so rigid, they're so crystalline, that there's not this way to flex. And so when we are talking about meeting people where they're at, and when we're talking about inclusivity, it needs to not just be about sex differences or racial differences, but it should also be about different personality types. And different personality types have different, drives toward collaboration, or different drives toward competitiveness, or whatever. So I think you really resonates.
One of the points that I make really is the gender gap exists for reasons that really don't have to do with gender. They have to do with certain behaviors and personality types that cluster more highly among women, but that aren't really about just stereotypes and bias in that way. And I used to make a joke, like, if you have 10 senior executives, 5 men, 5 women, but all 10 are aggressive narcissists, does it still count as diversity?
Yes. I mean, it's a big point. It's a massive point.
And the other thing you said about, treating, the old world way, it's treating HR as a line item. I think that comes, or an example of that is an article I shared recently on LinkedIn that you had commented on, that you agreed. So there was a Wall Street Journal article about the lack of female CEOs, and the data that they pulled to support their findings classify, roles at a company as profit and loss or non-profit and loss, and the heads of HR, which are predominantly women, were not counted as a profit and loss role, which really is just is shocking to me, because my point was, they're responsible for all the people that actually create the strategy and the service or the product and do all the work. So how is that not related to profit and loss? And I think that harkens back to a very industrial age mindset and era,
100%.
Which is, people were really cogs in a machine. If you're on an assembly line, you are performing manual labor that were eventually taken over by computers and machines. And now we're in an era where our contribution is in the form of intellect and imagination and creativity. And that's not stuff that's simply line item material. That has to be extracted from people in a way that they are motivated. And so that's why motivation is so much more important now. And people are motivated by different things, but we're still hamstrung to this old kind of system that treats people like cogs. And that's
and it's a totally bizarre way to think about things, again, especially as this thing has swung toward this more knowledge work, where it's not about brute strength and can I pick up a railroad tie and pound pound a railroad stake into it, right? I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
about, I need to move code with my mind, or I need to persuade somebody with this line of thinking or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And those are, those are obviously not sort of musculature based tasks. Those are sort of emotion based tasks, and all behaviors are rooted in some emotion. And yet, to your point, this sort of vestigial structure is like still in place.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's one way to look at it is, and I touch on this briefly in the book, but in the industrial age, let's use Henry Ford as an example. So he had supply in the form of physical parts, right? His factories and the parts of the cars were, the biggest asset and the biggest form of supply that he had. Well, today, the majority of supply of the biggest companies in the world is not stored in warehouses. It's stored in the brains of their employees. Because if you are solving business problems, creating marketing strategies, coding, these are all intellectual outputs. But
right.
Google is not going through all the rigorous hiring processes. I'm sorry, Google is going through that because they don't make things. They apply their employees' intellect to business problems and to create digital services and communication platforms. And the point here is that the power dynamic has shifted because, now employees own the supply. It's their own brains. And engagement is at abysmal levels. The reason that that's so critical is because if that's your supply, that means today, a CEO that wakes up and doesn't care about employee engagement, it's like setting fire. It's like Henry Ford waking up every morning and setting fire to 80% of his factories, just burning all the supply every single day he wakes up. The point being that engagement is the supply metric. And if your employees are only 20% engaged, I think actually the numbers are like more around 10% or 5%. But the reason that engagement is so important is because that's your supply. And if you increase employee engagement, you're increasing, your supply. And if you don't, you're wasting it. Like literally it's the analogy of setting fire to a factory, every morning you wake up. So people don't think about it that way. But now that the power has shifted from physical parts to intellect and imagination and information, it needs this different kind of a different kind of way of being managed and motivated. And it just, that mentality of this new world, it hasn't caught up yet.
No, it hasn't caught up. And as there's no real correlation, by the way, like if you look at the research, there's no correlation between sort of intellect and personality type. There's high intellect across all these different personality types. And there's really no correlation either between different sexes. So to your point, if the name of the game now is intellect, and if it is knowledge work and so forth, then we should be, again, setting up spaces in the corporate environment that allow for people to put their unique gifts to work. And those things are always either going to be hindered or empowered by the values of that space and what that space values.
And how the system is set up, frankly.
Exactly.
Because right now, another big point of the book is corporate structures are, by their nature, zero-sum games. If you win a promotion, it means I lost a promotion. And at Google and Facebook, your performance is rated not on an absolute, but relative to your peers. You can't, on your team, you can't have two people that are equally amazing or equally terrible. Everybody has to be either better or worse than the person that they work with. And so when you have a zero-sum game and the points of the game are unclear, like success metrics aren't, neatly benchmarked and everyone doesn't agree on like what exactly a win looks like. What happens is people will just put their needs ahead of everyone else in order to get ahead and get the win. And it destroys trust and it makes teamwork impossible, true teamwork. So I think in the transition from industrial to knowledge economy, the role of HR emerges as one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. And right now, it's not seen that way, but it's going to either have to change or it's either going to come from tearing down the old or building the new.
Yeah, and it's going to swing, like to your point, it's going to change one way or another. And there is like a massive blind spot across the sort of corporate landscape. And in particular, the blind spot is concentrated at the top. Like it's not, there's not a blind spot in the HR department. The HR department and the ethics and compliance departments, they recognize the impact that they can have on culture, and they recognize the value of empowering people and, creating sort of safe places that people can feel included in, and purposes that resonate with people's core. Like it's, we're good to go at that level. The blind spot is at the top, where these lessons from the 80s and the 90s MBA schools around, ultimately it's labor units and it's supply and demand lines and all those other things, are still, the hands that are holding the reins of business. And I'm just saying that either it's going to be from a generational shift or whatever, but there are light bulbs on in the organization, and those are either going to your point, kind of trickle up to the top as sort of attrition happens and people sort of grow up there, or those people are going to turn those light bulbs on themselves and see like, wow, there's like a massive strategic opportunity here if we can make a couple of tweaks and actually meet people where they're at. And here's a like framework that we use in our business that I'm sure I stole or whatever from somewhere else, but like there's a difference. And I think you kind of talked about this at least tangentially, or really, I mean, I would say kind of directly in your book, but there's a difference between a rock star and a superstar. And so I think a superstar is what people would typically call, the type A personality that just ascends through the organization, or the caricature of the lean in woman, right? Who kind of leans into these sort of male things or whatever. Again, these are
no, I get it.
Strokes, right? So like, yeah, that there is a place in every organization for a superstar. And some of those people are, like you talked about in your book, they want to move up and boom, 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 and they want to keep climbing, and that's their main thing. But there's a lot of people in our organization, for example, that I would call rock stars, and they are A+ players, but they don't want to move up. They are happy with it.
It's kind of like Sheryl Sandberg and me. I felt, and not to call myself a rock star, it sounds very immodest, but I just mean that in the caricature you're describing, I was a person who loved my job and was making an incredible impact by teaching salespeople and telling stories. This is at Google. And then I couldn't move up unless I managed a team, which would have taken me off the work that I loved, and I didn't want to be a manager. I wanted to be an individual contributor, but there was no place for me to go in the organization unless I became the superstar. Now, what's interesting is when Mark Zuckerberg describes his partnership with Sheryl, it's very much what you're saying, because he has publicly said many times that he really likes the strategy and the product side and is not as interested or adept at the systems, operations, all that other kind of stuff that's necessary to run a business. So they have this bifurcated thing where he focuses on, perhaps what you mean by rock star stuff, which is like building and creating and solving. And she focused on the superstar stuff, which is organizing and structuring and scaling. And you need both in an organization. Right. Now, what I always found fascinating was if he recognizes that bifurcation is critical to his success, why don't we give that opportunity to other people in the organization? Like, it's
if you can climb to the top, then you can be yourself.
Right, exactly. Like so one of my best friends, Sarah, is like a Sheryl type, and we used to work. We were in grad school together, and we were incredible partners in school. Like we just, it was such a yin yang kind of thing that we were like amazing as teammates and partners, and we did all this stuff together. We'd be amazing in business. That sort of partnership that allows people to lean, quote, no pun intended, lean into what they're good at exists only when you are Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, without any recognition that setup would work incredibly well, not just for them, but everyone in the organization. But you have to be a Sheryl in order to climb from the bottom to the top, because by nature of a triangle, right, spots become more scarce. You have to manage big teams. So there's no room for rock stars at the top, which is unfortunate because the company loses out.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. Like, how do you change that structure then? Like, I don't know.
It's not that difficult in some way, right? Like, it's just we're so used to thinking inside the lines and inside the box of how things are done today.
That's right.
Like at Bridgewater, which I talk about briefly in the book too, they have dual or even a tribe management structure where there's more than just one, the buck has to stop with somebody, but in
Right.
terms of managerial functions and strategic and product functions, they have, checks and balances. I think there's like two or three people at the top, and that serves as a great way to divide labor among the skill sets that people possess instead of forcing them to be everything. And I think, I have a friend one of my friends, Julie, we met when I started at Google 17 years ago now, which is crazy. But
Right.
she left Google after a while and she moved back to her hometown in Madison, Wisconsin, and started a bakery. And we went on a girls' trip recently, and she had just read Lean Out, and she said to me, was so fascinating is she was having an issue, and the bakery is not just a storefront, they do distribution to like Costco, it's an operation.
Yeah.
And there was a woman that works for her who was amazing and deserved a promotion, but it would have taken her off like the baking piece. And there was another guy that really wanted the top job, but she didn't know what to do because she was afraid that if they gave the promotion to him, it meant that the woman who was doing such a good job wouldn't get, what she deserved, and that he wouldn't, the head guy wouldn't respect her as much, or she wouldn't have as much influence. And then she read my book and it kind of had this aha, like, oh, well, I don't have to include management operation responsibilities in the promotion. So what she did was she gave the head job to that guy, but promoted the woman to be of equal
Status or something. Yeah.
right? So she still has equal input on the decision-making process and influence, but she can remain in her, she can stay within her desired area of baking. And she got a raise and she got added benefits. And Julie's point to me was, the answer was so simple, but we're just so used to thinking inside the lines of this hierarchy. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we just think it's the only way. And some of the solutions are actually fairly simple if we give ourselves permission to think outside the box.
Yeah, and it sounds kind of cliche, but it's actually true, right? It's like, well, what's kind of the fixed variable in this equation? And like, well, if none of them are really fixed, or if the people are fixed, or the way that these people can sort of feel are fixed, because that's really where the conflict with your friend Julie was, right? She's like, well, it feels like the right thing to do is to give this person a promotion and this person a promotion, but how do I do that in this sort of...
And she runs the business, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
right.
It's the limit of the mind. It's
right.
a mental limit. And I think you just kind of I just asked the question and you just kind of proved the point to me.
Right.
Which is the same thing.
It's like that's all we know is this structure. Right. So we can't conceive of any other way. When really there's simple things like, making promotions not contingent upon management as you get higher up. And I think there's one other point in there. Oh, there's another thing too, a repercussion of structuring people in this way. Just like this woman loved baking and was amazing at it, she was going to have much more of an positive impact remaining as a baker versus operations, because you can't scale qualities like that. Creativity doesn't scale. So for example, my strength was getting on stage and working, presenting to salespeople these stories that they could use, and developing the stories they could use in pitches, and then teaching them how to do it. I was required, in order to get promoted, I had to manage a team, and I was really reluctant to do that. One reason is I would have much less impact because my skills in that area don't scale. I can't teach a team of people to do it the way that I do it. And it's the same thing with like software engineers who love coding and are amazing coders. You can't take an amazing coder and have them manage a team of 100 people to scale their impact. That's not how you just have the coder work on bigger, more impactful coding projects.
Right.
It's what they work on that has to expand, not the amount of people they manage. And that is to force people into management and take them off the thing that they're really good. It's really an issue for creative people. This is not even a male-female thing.
No, right.
or creative people who like to build and solve problems and stuff, making their promotions contingent upon management takes them off the thing they're good at and probably makes them unhappier. So it's a lose-lose.
Yeah, and I think, kind of a crude example of this is the classic kind of, a great salesperson might not be the best sales manager, but you see those guys, move
Yeah,
up and it falls, and it's like, well, because those are different skill sets. The thing that they're
exactly.
great at is sort of hearts and minds stuff, not administrative. Hey,
Right.
give me your sales report stuff. But
Right.
that's the only next step for the guy.
And then bringing it full circle back to the Henry Ford thing, the assembly line was like the biggest innovation, right, in business. Right. Well, it was divided labor. Sorry, division of labor was a huge
which is the basis
catalyst.
Of the assembly line, right?
So, right. So if you look at the analogy today of division of labor, that's exactly what we're talking about. You're dividing mental labor. So you're keeping creative people on creative stuff. You're keeping really like organized type A people on the organizing and the scaling and the administrative, and like, that is, I think, once people can get their head around it and actually sort of manifest it, that's the catalyst for bringing, companies into the future. Because if brains are the supply, then division of labor is skill set. Yeah,
oh wow, that's actually, there may be another book in there.
I know. I actually started working on an article about this like months ago, and maybe I should pick that one back up.
Well, I think it's super revolutionary. I mean, it's like, it's like all these things that are super revolutionary. Many times they're just like so simple, it's just
right.
Like,
they're the kind of things that you look at and say like, duh. Why didn't we think of that?
And I'm saying that's one of those things, 100%.
Yeah. But I think that those kind of ideas are often overlooked in the beginning because they are so simple. They seem
I can't do
unextraordinary. They're not extraordinary because they're like, and then over time, you only see the power in the idea as, in the future.
Yeah. And so I want to touch on two things. One is, what is a profit and loss center then? It just doesn't make any sense. Like if HR is not a profit and loss center, which is basically an enablement of the main asset of most businesses, then how is marketing a profit and loss center?
Right. I don't remember how the Wall Street Journal classified the different. I just remember HR was not one of them. But at the same time, I don't really understand the point of labeling something a P&L role versus a non-P&L role. Like, yeah,
it's a very, very bizarre approach.
It doesn't make sense to me.
Especially if a business is an organism, I don't know, like tie it to the body. Like the body needs all these different organs and all these different things to work. Well, it's not the heart. Well, yeah, but it's the lungs. You know what I'm saying? Like,
right.
Like it's needed. It's part of the whole mix. It's part of the cross-functional, synergistic organism that a cohesive organism is supposed to, or cohesive business is supposed to be.
Right.
And yet you want to kind of push, these things. Well, we can't spend money over there. Oh, it's time to tighten our belt. Let's fire people from the HR department, or let's trim down the compliance budget. It just seems totally backwards.
Right. I don't know. I just don't understand profit and loss role as a category, but maybe there's a good reason. I don't know. It just doesn't immediately I don't get it.
It feels like that, hey,
it feels like a nice way of saying what roles are important and what
exactly
not a nice way, but like a business
simple,
jargony way, so that you can sort of sidestep any value judgment.
Totally. So I wanted to talk a little bit about culture real quick before we wrap up, because I just want to be conscious of your time. Well, first of all, how cool was it was this your first time going back to Google since you left? And was that a cool kind of full circle thing, or have you been doing that for a while?
So you're referring to, this week I just mentioned, I don't know if we were recording yet, but I went out to LA earlier this week to speak at a Google offsite. But this is actually that was my third time speaking at Google since I've left. I did their Women's Summit in New York about a year ago, in last March, and I did their Women's Summit in October in Chicago, and then this was a team offsite out in LA. So cool. It is super cool to do, go back, and it is so right now I'm speaking full time as my career, and I love going back to Google and giving this talk because it just feels like home in a way. And there is something very sort of poignant for me as
Yeah,
sort of like a return.
totally.
Yeah, so I love talking at Google for sure.
And again, I'm not trying to bash either of these organizations because we're all learning and
Hmm.
things change from time to time. But I want to kind of double click on the culture piece in the sense of a lot of people think, oh, culture is kombucha and ping
Ah,
pong tables and all these sort of
yeah.
I don't know what you want to call them, sort of temporal, sort of surface level things. But I'd love you to kind of speak into a little bit around like, well, what is a real culture, and is it something that's really rooted more in sort of like true safety and true,
Hmm.
an ability for all different plants to grow?
Hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So a lot of companies, I think, try and change their culture, bring a more progressive element by including these or adopting these kind of surface level things like ping pong tables and common areas and things like that. But ultimately, for me, when we talk about culture of business, the ideal is a culture in which there is trust and people can be themselves, like a culture that allows people to be themselves and be authentic. And that is really, and first of all, Google did all this research years ago that into what makes the most effective teams. They used
Right.
kind of their own employees as the data set, and the most important element they found was psychological safety, which is another way of saying trust and people can be themselves and feel free to take risks and that
Yeah.
they're not going to be punished and things like that. I think that's the ideal in an organization. And I don't think that, and I think culture is thought of as soft and secondary. But if you think about it as an environment of trust, then it has enormous business implications. And I
Even more
think,
so, sorry, even more so, into your point, in an environment where the main asset is in people's brains. How do you
yeah,
unlock that?
because then, right, if people go to work and feel comfortable being themselves, they feel engaged and they contribute because the opposite of trust is fear. And in a culture of fear, people are not engaged. They're just trying to save their ass every day. I'm sorry, can I curse? I just
Yeah,
did. So
that was a minor. That was a minor curse. That's
right.
fine.
I'll
Yeah.
save the F bombs for after.
Yeah, but that's exactly what it is. And then the eye is off the ball. It's not. It's definitely not on the organization's purpose. It's on the sort of, okay, I got to
Saving themselves.
self-preservation.
Right.
Exactly.
Because people, their livelihoods are on the line. So it's understandable. And I talk about this in the book. I devote a whole chapter to what companies can do to sort of create these cultures where there's a sense of trust that um, and that people are able to be authentic. I think it's an ideal. I don't think it's necessarily something that can be realized 100% because we're all human. But I think where we are right now is really at the
Yeah.
opposite end of that spectrum. So movement toward the ideal is possible and should be encouraged.
Yeah, and I think we got to get these mindsets at the top changed, and that's really what I feel like my new mission is.
Well,
Um,
yeah, but I mean, the problem is that change, getting people at that level to change, the change represents a threat to their own power, so it's difficult. And I don't
it's a
know.
path of persuasion. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
like I'm not saying that it's just easy. Hey, read this book and you'll get it. But I'm saying that if in fact
Although
it's
they
better
should
for
read
people,
my book,
they
and then
absolutely
maybe
should read
they'll
the
get
book.
it.
Yeah, find it on Amazon. Again, I swear I think it should be required reading.
Me
But
too. Thank you.
but it's like, if in fact making people feel safe at work, let's just boil it all down to that statement that should encapsulate everything we're talking about, right? If
Right.
making people feel safe at work, it's a better thing. It's better. That's better to do on like the human side, and also doing that provides more on the dollar side.
It's a
Then there's
tremendous,
then
yeah.
there's no real argument against it. It's just a question of how do you sort of make that path of persuasion to turn
Right.
those light bulbs on. But I mean, we're not trying to sell somebody something that like is wrong or that doesn't
Right.
actually
They
unlock
have
value.
to understand why it's a direct bottom line issue, which it is. It directly impacts the bottom line and in very big ways, but it's less visible and less obvious. So you have to bring that to light and make it obvious. The other thing is, I just had a thought and I lost it.
Well,
I wanted to clarify really what I mean by safe and psychology, because it can feel like squishy and soft to say that. I don't mean that people come to work and they can do whatever they want because there's no consequences.
correct.
Or that people come to work and that we're trying to increase the trustworthiness of the people at the company. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that there are systems in place and checks and balances so that people feel decisions aren't at the whims of a manager who has total control and power over them, and that decisions aren't being made arbitrarily, that there is a system in place to protect the employees when they deserve protection. And I think that's a very basic, fundamental aspect of being a human being and needing to know that, if you make a mistake, but you did so with the best of intentions for the business or other people, that there's somebody or some system in place to protect you. And I don't think people feel that way right now. Performance measures and grades are a lot of times arbitrary. They are usually an emotional decision by a manager who may or may not have your best interests in mind, and that can feel incredibly frustrating. And this goes back to imbuing HR, the head of HR, with power to make decisions in the best interests of the people that they represent, not just to make decisions based on the people with the power in the company.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, right? Something we say a lot is like the soft stuff is actually the hard stuff.
Yeah.
And, there is kind of a balance between, it's kind of like a family in a sense. So I have I want to create a family where my children feel loved and they know that they're loved and they feel safe and that they know that their dad loves them. All those things, take that to the bank. But that also doesn't negate the fact that I have high expectations for them and they will not be disrespectful and they will be honorable and all those other things. So the safety piece is both things, and then it allows them to have the trust to, in high school when something is going bad, they can call me up and I'll go and get them in the middle of the night without them having to get into their friend's car when they shouldn't be driving or something, right?
100%. I think what you're describing is the ideal in so many aspects of life, which is that balance between authority and trust and safety. So it's like authority and boundaries and trust and safety. If you think of it as like two sides of the scales, right? The balance is always the ideal. And I think the journey in life is always, as a person, to sort of get toward the center or move toward the middle, because too extreme on authority and boundaries and control creates one set of problems, and then too extreme on the love is all you need kind of warmth, love, then that's its own set of problems, and neither, you need both. And so I think we've so over-indexed on one side.
Yep.
What I'm trying to do is not bring everyone to the other extreme. It's just bringing us toward the middle so that both kind of soft, quote unquote, soft and hard skills are seen as equally valuable. And I think it also, in a way, indirectly speaks to the quote that I used to open the book, which I think completely captures the spirit of Lean Out, which is, feminism isn't about making women strong. Women are already strong. It's about changing the way the world perceives that strength.
Yes.
And so I think that in a way, it's what we're talking about. These soft skills are actually tremendously powerful and have their own unique strength to them. They're just, one, not perceived as being, equally valuable. And two, in a zero-sum game for power and dominance, those soft things are actually a liability in getting ahead. Because if your win is someone else's loss, then
it's cutthroat. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the rules of the game. It's like Game of Thrones, So it's system and structure and also behavioral.
Yeah, I think that quote does really kind of encapsulate everything that we've been talking about here. Listen, I appreciate you so much for coming on and making some time for us. This was like, I had really high hopes for this call, and it just like blasted right through them. How
Well,
can people find you? How can they follow you? How can they
yeah.
hear more of your read more of your writings and catch
Yeah.
more of your thoughts?
So I am on, first of all, my book is in in retail stores, not all of them, but it's in Barnes and Noble and various bookshops, but also obviously on Amazon, Lean Out, The Truth About Women Power in the Workplace. And then right now I'm speaking at companies and conferences full time. So people can reach out to my website, marissaorr.com, and then social media, I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn is at Marissa Beth Orr, Beth, MarissabethOrr. And then I know this is all like it would be much better if I had one universal handle, but I was a little bit too late, clearly, to the social
2020
media.
though, so everyone has a lot of room for this kind of stuff now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I'm on LinkedIn, and also I have some articles posted on this stuff and more on Medium, and that's just at Marissa Orr, so medium.com/
Oh, cool.
Orr.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for leaning into Lean Out, leaning into this message. No pun intended. No, that was an intended pun. But thank you for pushing this message out. I think the more that we can sort of talk about it, the more that we can spread this around, we're gonna turn these light bulbs on and really kind of make the world a better workplace, which is where we spend all of our time. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, and thank you for being so supportive. As a reader and fan of the book, I really appreciate it. And thanks for having me on today.
Absolutely. Have a great day.